I'm Liz Lehfeldt, and I'm the Vice President of the Teaching Division for the American Historical Association.
And I'm John McNeill from Georgetown University, and I am the President-elect in training of the American Historical Association. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Teaching Division. Liz, how would you describe the general mission of the Teaching Division?
The mission of the Teaching Division is actually fairly straightforward. Our mission is to promote the teaching and instruction of history at all levels within the profession. So we work on K through 12. We obviously work on undergraduate and graduate instruction in history. But I think embedded in that is something that's probably implicit, but that bears saying, which is that it is the Teaching Division's mission to do those things because we think that instruction in history has value, that history as a discipline has value, and that we want as many students as possible to come into contact with that value.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a mission I can easily get behind. So how would you say the Teaching Division's work has evolved in recent years? The AHA has had some initiatives going on, such as the tuning project. Mm-hmm. How has that affected the Teaching Division?
I think it has really kind of enlivened and enriched what the AHA has been able to do around teaching. So around 2011, 2012, the AHA got a grant from the Lumina Foundation to kick off this thing called the Tuning Project, which was modeled on some similar projects that had taken place in European university settings. And the goal behind the Tuning Project was to bring faculty together. It was a very kind of grassroots, from the ground up project, bring faculty together and get them to articulate the value of studying history. All of us in our classes and in our interactions with students know that we're doing something important, know that we care about history, but the Tuning Project was designed to make those things more explicit, to be more self-conscious about how we talked with students about the value of studying history. And this was largely built around doing this for history majors, because we were all sort of coming into contact with prospective students and their parents and other constituencies who were saying, well, we know history is nice, but what can you do with it? And so our goal was to articulate the skills and competencies and habits of mind that are embodied in majoring in history, and to sort of create documents and vocabulary around that, but not just for the benefit of faculty, but also for the benefit of students. We wanted to empower the students who major in history, who might be sitting across the table from a potential employer, to talk about the things that they can do now that they have finished a degree in history, to be able to talk about their communication skills, to be able to talk about their ability to synthesize information, collect data, analyze that data, and those sorts of things. And so that was the Tuning Project, and I think what that's done is get us all talking about this thing that we love, which is the study of history. And so as a consequence, like, for example, at the annual meeting this year in 2018, somebody remarked to me how much of what we were doing in sessions around teaching and learning at the conference was actually being led by or initiated by people who had worked on the Tuning Project. So it's clearly kind of energized people around the teaching of history and inspired them to certainly continue the work of tuning, but also to sort of branch out from there to work on all other kinds of initiatives around teaching history, how our students learn history, how we prepare our students for what they do after they graduate from college.
A lot of that resonates with me. I hear first and second year students all the time saying, I'd love to major in history, but my parents say,
yes,
maybe, what are you going to do with that? Or maybe you should try econ, or
right.
You know, I expect we all hear that. So how is the Teaching Division looking at its work right now? What are the challenges that are preoccupying you?
Yeah, so the tuning project, as I said, was focused on the work we were doing with history majors. But as soon as we really started digging into that, we invariably and inevitably started having conversations about all of our history courses, not just the coursework that we were doing with our majors in mind. So we began having conversations about, history survey courses or introductory courses within our departments. And once we started having those conversations, that sort of segued into a conversation about enrollments in these courses. And what we began to hear anecdotally from history department chairs and directors of undergraduate studies and others was that somewhere in the last, 8 or 9 years, there had been a drop-off in enrollments in history courses. We weren't just seeing a decline in the number of majors, which the tuning project had in part tried to address, but we were also just more generally seeing that not as many students were taking, the American History Survey or these sorts of courses. And so we decided to dig in and see what was going on. Again, anecdotally we were hearing things, but we thought, let's really see if we can wrap our head around what's happening here. And so we've done several things. We've surveyed history departments, and we've administered this survey a couple of times now to really get a picture of what's going on, to move beyond anecdote and find out from departments, are your enrollments declining? If so, how much? If they're not, have you just sort of stemmed the tide, or are you growing? And those sorts of things.
Let me interrupt here,
yeah, sure.
if I may. What do those data tell us?
Those data tell us that history course enrollments are definitely declining, that the anecdotal evidence was accurate in that sense. But it is also revealing that there are instances where this isn't happening. And so obviously we want to talk to those folks and say, okay, what are you doing that seems to be working? We're discovering too, as we did with tuning, that a lot of this varies by institution. For example, one of the most common explanations for why enrollments are declining in introductory level courses is because there's been some institutional change in general education requirements. That's something that the college or university has done, has either kind of taken the surveys out of the requirements or refashioned the requirements in such a way that history is now at a bit of a disadvantage as far as that's concerned. So yeah, we learned that what we suspected was true, but that in some instances perhaps it wasn't as bad as we thought. And then we said, okay, now we've got a sort of picture of what's going on, but how might we begin to address the issue? And so we started having conversations with department chairs. We took advantage of some regional meetings of department chairs to meet with them and talk about what was happening in their courses with enrollments. And then we decided, let's get some of these people who are doing interesting things, who seem to have some strategies that work as far as at least holding enrollment steady or growing enrollments. Let's get them together to share some of that wisdom. So at the last annual meeting, we met with department chairs at the luncheon that we have for department chairs every year, and just sort of got them talking about enrollments. And then went back to that group and said, how many of you would be willing to participate in a roundtable at the annual meeting in 2018 to discuss this? So yesterday, we had 3 roundtables on the topic, 12 presenters from a variety of institutions. We tried to group the sessions by institutional type. And these folks presented on the kinds of things that they're doing at their institutions to work on the question of enrollments. And my hope had been that 15 or 20 people would attend each roundtable, and we would have done a good thing and done good service for the profession. We had 60 people at the first session and about 50 people at the second and third session. So I think we've clearly tapped into something that people are interested in, and so we need to decide going forward what does the membership need from us next on this subject.
Is there any evidence that requirements and expectations have changed at the K through 12 level, so that perhaps, this is an ignorant hypothesis, fewer students upon arriving at college or university have had exposure to history, and so fewer know that they like it?
I think it's less that and more that the exposure they've had has not excited them about history. So they've had some history, but they think it's memorization, and they don't realize that, you know, particularly at the college level, history is so much more than that. So some of it, and folks at the roundtable talked about this, some of it is then getting these students as early as possible, either as prospective students or as brand new students on campus, and finding ways to show them what history is. That it's, you know, it's exciting investigative work in a lot of ways. And so trying to get them as early as possible and kind of disabuse them of any notions they might have about history based on their high school experience. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, as far as what they've how they've experienced history before they get to university, a fair number of them will have had advanced placement courses in history. There are 3 AP history courses, World, European, and US history. And if they've done well enough on those exams, they will actually place out of, at some institutions, the history requirements. And so some of the presenters talked about how they've tried to deal with that creatively, you know, because their institution may say, for example, that they have to award credit for a score of a 5, which is the highest score you can get on an AP test. But instead of just sort of throwing their hands up in defeat in the face of that, what they've done is they've contacted those incoming students who got a 5 on one of the AP history exams and said, hey, you're clearly really good at history. Why don't you take this 1 credit course that we offer that, again, tries to kind of expose them to a more kind of experiential sense of what it is to do history, and maybe tap into their enthusiasm for history and get them to take some subsequent history courses as a consequence. So instead of saying, oh, well, we've lost them, they've already gotten the credit for this history course, why don't we kind of harness their enthusiasm for history and see if we can translate that into them taking some more of our courses?
What are some of the other great ideas that bubbled up in the session yesterday from programs and schools that are having more success?
Yeah, it's interesting because we really did cast this broadly in terms of enrollments, not just majors. A lot of institutions were capitalizing on getting students to either double major in history or, I think more examples of this, minor in history. So they had gone after you know, students not even in allied disciplines. They'd gone after the business majors, the engineering majors, who might have a passion and enthusiasm for history, but be worried, along with their parents, about, well, what am I going to do, you know, with a history degree? And if you can't quite convince them that there's plenty they can do with a history degree, and they're still going to major in engineering, to make the pitch to them that, well, what about a minor in history? Particularly, actually, if they bring in any AP credit. They may already be a third or a half of the way to a minor in history, depending on what the requirements are. So a lot of people were doing interesting things around recruiting minors for history. A lot of examples, I mean, it varied from institution to institution, but a lot of examples of various kinds of outreach events. A lot of people, not surprisingly in our current political climate, are kind of using current events as a really nice springboard to bring students into the conversation about history. You know, history of presidential elections, histories of sexual harassment, you know, and a lot of the hot button topics that students are hearing about every day, and demonstrating to them that these things don't happen in a vacuum, they happen in a historical context, and that there is in fact a history to these things as well. And people reported those sorts of events being extremely well attended, you know, drawing larger student crowds than other kinds of events typically do.
The most effective thing we do on my campus is put your friend, Amy Leonard, in front of a lot of freshmen.
Yes.
And she's such a great teacher
Right.
that people keep coming back to other history courses.
Yes. Yeah, and that came up frequently in the presentations yesterday. The importance of who you put in those introductory courses, the importance wherever possible, and other, some institutions are more constrained in this regard, but wherever possible, putting full-time tenure track or tenure stream faculty in those positions, not because adjunct or contingent instructors are not good, they are often quite good, but just because there's no continuity within the institution. If you get a student really excited about history at the hands of a part-time instructor, they may then be very disappointed when 2 semesters from now that part-time instructor is no longer at the institution. And so wherever possible, the sentiment was certainly put good teachers in the introductory courses, and wherever possible, make sure that those individuals are also full-time members of the department.
Makes a lot of sense to me.